The greatest war in Greek mythology lasted 10 years. One man found a way to end it. He defeated an army, escaped monsters, and defied the gods themselves. But after surviving all of that, the hardest thing he ever had to do was simply find his way home. His name was Odysseus, the hero the gods couldn't control.
The Story Vault. Unlock the untold.
If you've ever heard the phrase, the Trojan Horse, then you've already heard part of Odysseus' story. You just might not realize it. Most people think the Trojan Horse is just an old legend, a giant wooden horse, soldiers hiding inside, the gates open, the city falls. It's one of the most famous stories ever told. But here's the strange part. The horse was never the real story. The real story was the man who came up with it. Because without Odysseus, there probably wouldn't have been a Trojan horse at all. To understand why, we need to go back nearly 3,000 years to a world where people believed the gods walked among them, where kings ruled small kingdoms instead of nations, where honor meant everything, and where one insult could start a war that lasted 10 years. That war was the Trojan War. If you've seen the movie Troy, or heard the names Achilles, Hector, or Helen of Troy, you're already familiar with the basics. According to Greek mythology, Prince Paris of Troy fell in love with Helen. The problem? Helen was already married to Menelaus, the king of Sparta. Paris took Helen back to Troy. Whether she went willingly or not depends on which version of the story you read. But one thing never changes. The Greeks saw it as an insult they couldn't ignore. Soon, kings from across Greece joined together. Thousands of ships crossed the sea, and they laid siege to the city of Troy. They expected a quick victory. Instead, the war dragged on. 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, then 10. Imagine spending a decade fighting the same enemy without knowing if you'd ever see home again. That's where Odysseus enters the story. Unlike Achilles, Odysseus wasn't the strongest warrior on the battlefield. If you were building an army, he probably wouldn't be your first pick for a duel. He wasn't the fastest, he wasn't the biggest, he wasn't invincible. What made him dangerous was something you couldn't see: his mind. Odysseus was king of Ithaca, a small island kingdom. Not the richest, not the most powerful, but he had something many other kings didn't. He knew that winning a fight wasn't always about fighting harder. Sometimes the smartest move was convincing your enemy they'd already won.
There's actually a funny story about him before the war even began. When the Greek kings came to recruit him, Odysseus didn't want to go. He had a wife, Penelope, a baby son named Telemachus. He had a peaceful kingdom, and he knew something others didn't. If he left for Troy, he might not come back for a very long time.
So, according to the legend, he pretended to be insane. He hitched a donkey and an ox to the same plow, something no sane farmer would ever do. Then he started plowing the beach while scattering salt instead of seeds. The idea was simple. If they think I'm crazy, they won't ask me to fight. Honestly, it's kind of brilliant. But the Greeks weren't convinced. One of the messengers picked up Odysseus' infant son and placed him directly in front of the moving plow. If Odysseus really were insane, he'd keep walking. Instead, he stopped immediately, carefully lifted his son out of the way. And in that moment, everyone knew. He'd been pretending all along. So, off to Troy he went. That's one of my favorite details about Odysseus. Before he ever fooled an enemy, he tried to fool his own allies. And it tells you something important about him. He wasn't chasing glory. He wasn't desperate to become a legend. If anything, he wanted the opposite. He wanted to stay home. That's what makes him so different from heroes like Achilles. Achilles wanted immortal fame. Odysseus wanted dinner with his family. He fought because circumstances forced him to, not because he loved war. But once he arrived at Troy, everything changed. Year after year, the Greeks kept attacking. Year after year, the Trojans kept holding them back. The city walls were too strong. The defenders were too determined. And eventually, even the greatest warriors started running out of ideas. Imagine 10 years of failure. 10 years away from home. 10 years watching your friends die. At some point, people stop asking how to win. And then Odysseus had an idea. Not a better sword, not a stronger army, an idea. One so simple that it sounded completely ridiculous. Build an enormous wooden horse. Hide soldiers inside it. Pretend to sail away. And hope the Trojans bring the horse into their own city. Think about how crazy that sounds. You're trying to conquer the most heavily defended city in the Greek world. And your plan is to give them a gift? If someone pitched that idea today, you'd probably laugh. In fact, many Greeks almost certainly did. But Odysseus understood something most generals didn't. Every wall has a weakness. Sometimes that weakness isn't made of stone. It's human nature. The Trojans believed they had finally won. The Greek ships disappeared over the horizon. The enemy was gone. The giant horse looked like a peace offering, a symbol of surrender, a trophy. They celebrated. They opened the gates themselves. They rolled the horse inside the city. And that night, while everyone slept, the soldiers hidden inside climbed out. They opened the gates, the Greek army returned, and after 10 long years, Troy finally fell. The world would remember the Trojan horse forever. But here's the strange part. For Odysseus, the war was over. His greatest victory was behind him. He had survived. He had won. Now, all he had to do was sail home. It should have taken a few weeks, maybe a month. Instead, it would take him another 10 years. And before it was over, he would lose every single man who had sailed with him. You see, winning the war made Odysseus famous, but it also made him confident. Maybe a little too confident. Because during the fall of Troy, he made one mistake. A mistake so small that most people wouldn't even think twice about it. But one Greek god never forgot. Not long after leaving Troy, Odysseus and his men landed on a strange island. At first, it looked peaceful. No armies, no walls, no signs of danger. Just caves, goats, and plenty of food. His men thought they'd gotten lucky. Finally, a chance to rest. But Odysseus noticed something unusual. The cave they entered wasn't empty. Someone lived there. Someone very big. That someone was Polyphemus, a Cyclops. If you've ever imagined Cyclopses as slow, clumsy giants, forget that image. Polyphemus was enormous, strong enough to lift boulders like they were pebbles. And when he returned to his cave, he didn't ask who these strangers were. He didn't ask why they were there. He simply rolled a massive stone across the entrance, trapping everyone inside. Then, he picked up 2 of Odysseus's men and ate them. Just like that. No battle, no warning. Can you imagine how terrifying that must have been? You're trapped inside a cave. The only exit is blocked by a rock too heavy for dozens of men to move. Outside, there's no one coming to rescue you. And inside, the monster plans to eat you, one by one. Most heroes would have reached for their swords. Odysseus didn't. Because killing the Cyclops wouldn't solve the problem. Even if they somehow managed to bring him down, who was going to move that giant stone? Sometimes, strength creates new problems. But thinking creates new possibilities. So instead of fighting, Odysseus started talking. He offered the Cyclops wine. Strong wine. Much stronger than anything Polyphemus had ever tasted. The giant laughed, drank more, then more, until eventually he collapsed into a drunken sleep. That was the moment Odysseus had been waiting for. His men sharpened a giant wooden stake, held it over the fire until the tip glowed red. Then, together, they drove it into the Cyclops' single eye. The cave exploded with screams. Polyphemus stumbled blindly through the darkness. He grabbed at the air, smashed into the walls, shouted for help. Other Cyclopes came running. From outside the cave, they yelled, "Who's attacking you?" And Polyphemus answered, "Nobody." Now here's the clever part. Earlier, when the Cyclops had asked Odysseus his name, Odysseus had smiled and replied, "My name is Nobody." So when the other Cyclopes heard, "Nobody is hurting me," they thought he was either dreaming or losing his mind, and they walked away. It's probably one of the smartest tricks in all of Greek mythology, not because it required strength, but because it required thinking several moves ahead. The next morning, Polyphemus rolled the stone away, not because he wanted to free his prisoners, because he needed to let his sheep out. As each sheep passed, he ran his hands over their backs, checking whether the Greeks were trying to escape. But once again, Odysseus was already ahead of him. Instead of riding on top of the sheep, his men tied themselves underneath them. So when the blind Cyclops felt the wool, he never noticed the men hanging below. One by one, they slipped out of the cave. Alive. Against impossible odds, Odysseus had done it again. Not with muscles, not with magic, with his mind. And honestly, that should have been the perfect ending. He beat the monster, saved his crew, escaped the island. Everyone was alive. All he had to do was keep sailing. But then, something happened that tells you everything about who Odysseus really was. As the ships pulled away, he couldn't resist. He stood on the deck, looked back toward the island, and shouted across the sea, "You should know who defeated you!" Then he revealed his real name. "I am Odysseus, king of Ithaca." It was a moment of pride, maybe even triumph, but it was also the biggest mistake of his life. Because Polyphemus wasn't just any Cyclops, he was the son of Poseidon, god of the sea. And as the ships disappeared over the horizon, the blinded giant raised his hands to the sky and prayed to his father. Poseidon, make Odysseus suffer. If he must return home, let him return alone, and let him find nothing the way he left it. The sea fell silent. The wind changed. And from that moment on, Odysseus wasn't just sailing home anymore. He had become the enemy of a god. If there's one lesson Greek mythology loves to teach, it's this. You can outrun an army. You can outsmart a monster. But once you've made an enemy of a god, there's nowhere left to hide. From that moment on, the sea itself seemed to turn against Odysseus. Every time he thought he was getting closer to home, another storm appeared, another island, another impossible choice. It was as if Poseidon was saying, "You're not going home. Not yet." At first, Odysseus still believed he could beat whatever came next. After all, he'd survived 10 years of war, escaped a Cyclops. What else could the world possibly throw at him? Quite a lot, as it turned out. One day, his ships reached an island unlike any they'd seen before. It looked peaceful. Green hills, quiet forests, smoke rising from a beautiful house in the distance. Honestly, after months at sea, it looked like paradise. So Odysseus sent a group of his men to explore. They never came back. Hours passed. No sign of them. No cries for help. Nothing. So Odysseus went looking himself. And that's when he met Circe, a woman so beautiful that she didn't seem dangerous at all. But appearances can be very expensive, because Circe wasn't an ordinary woman. She was a powerful witch. She welcomed Odysseus's men into her home, served them food, poured them wine, smiled, and then, with a single spell, turned them into pigs. Literally, pigs. It's one of those moments that sounds almost ridiculous today, until you remember, Greek myths were never just about monsters. They were about temptation, trust, pride, fear. Every creature Odysseus meets represents another test, and Circe's test was simple. Can you tell the difference between comfort and danger? Luckily, Odysseus wasn't walking into this one alone. According to the myth, the messenger god Hermes appeared before him. He handed Odysseus a mysterious plant called moly, a magical herb. Its white flower and black root would protect him from Circe's spell. When Circe tried to enchant him, nothing happened. For the first time in a long while, someone had surprised the witch, not the other way around. Instead of fighting, they talked. Then something unexpected happened. Circe agreed to free his men. And somehow, the enemy became an ally. Odysseus and his crew stayed on her island, not for days, for an entire year. A whole year. Imagine that. After spending 10 years fighting a war and years trying to get home, Odysseus finally find somewhere safe. No storms, no monsters, no hunger. Good food, warm beds, no one trying to kill him. Honestly, most people probably would have stayed. But Odysseus couldn't, because no matter how comfortable life became, it wasn't home. That's one of my favorite things about his story. He keeps saying no to easier lives. He could have stopped fighting. He could have forgotten Ithaca. He could have built a new kingdom. Instead, he kept choosing the harder path. Because home wasn't just a place. It was the promise he'd made to himself. Finally, his men reminded him why they had left in the first place. We have families too. We've been gone long enough. And they were right. So Circe gave Odysseus something more valuable than magic: advice. Because she knew the sea ahead would be worse than anything he'd faced so far. She warned him about creatures called the Sirens. If you've ever heard someone say, "That song is like a siren's call," this is where that expression comes from. The Sirens didn't attack ships. They didn't throw spears. They simply sang. Their voices were so beautiful that sailors couldn't resist following them. Every ship that sailed toward the music crashed into the rocks. No one survived. Now think about that. How do you fight an enemy you don't want to fight? How do you resist something your own mind desperately wants? Once again, Odysseus came up with an answer no one else had. He ordered his men to melt beeswax and press it into their ears. No one would hear the song. Simple, effective, problem solved. Well, for everyone except him. Odysseus wanted to hear it, not because he thought he could resist, but because he wanted to know. Curiosity. That had always been one of his greatest strengths, and sometimes one of his greatest weaknesses. So he gave his men a strange order. Tie me to the mast. No matter what I say, no matter how much I beg, do not untie me. As the ship drifted closer, the singing began. The Sirens called his name, promised him knowledge, promised him glory, promised answers to every question he'd ever had. Odysseus struggled against the ropes. He screamed, he begged, he ordered his men to let him go. But they couldn't hear him. The wax blocked every sound. They simply kept rowing, straight ahead, until the singing faded into silence. And once again, Odysseus survived. Not because he was stronger, but because he understood something most people don't. Sometimes, the smartest way to resist temptation is to make the decision before temptation arrives. But Poseidon wasn't finished. Not even close. Because ahead of Odysseus waited two monsters, where there was no perfect choice. Only the chance to lose fewer people. And for the first time, not even his brilliant mind would be enough. After escaping the Sirens, Odysseus thought the worst might finally be behind him. It wasn't. Ahead of him, the sea narrowed into a passage no captain wanted to sail through. On one side, there was Scylla, a monster with 6 heads, each one capable of snatching a sailor straight from the deck. On the other side, there was Charybdis, a giant whirlpool that swallowed the sea itself. Sail too close to Scylla, and men would die. sail too close to Charybdis, and everyone would die. There was no perfect choice. Only the choice to lose fewer people. Sometimes that's what leadership really looks like. Not choosing between good and bad, choosing between bad and worse. Odysseus steered towards Scylla. He knew exactly what it would cost. 6 of his men were taken. There was nothing he could do. For perhaps the first time, his greatest weapon, his brilliant mind, couldn't save everyone. But the journey still wasn't over. Soon after, his exhausted crew landed on another island. There, grazing peacefully, were the sacred cattle of Helios, the sun god. Before they went ashore, Odysseus gave one simple order. Whatever happens, do not touch those cattle. His men agreed, and for a while, they obeyed. Then the winds changed. A storm trapped them on the island. One day passed, and another, and another. Their food ran out. They grew weaker, hungrier, desperate. And desperation has a way of changing people's minds. While Odysseus was asleep, his men made a decision. If we're going to die anyway, we might as well eat. They slaughtered the sacred cattle, cooked the meat, and hoped the gods would never know. But in Greek mythology, the gods always know. When Helios discovered what had happened, he demanded justice. Zeus answered. As soon as the ships returned to sea, the sky turned black. Thunder split the clouds. Lightning struck Odysseus' ship. The mast shattered. The sails caught fire. The sea swallowed everything. Every single member of his crew was lost. Every man who had survived Troy, every man who had escaped the Cyclops, every man who had followed him for years was gone. Odysseus was the only one left. Just think about that. When he first sailed away from home, he commanded a fleet. Now, he didn't even have a ship. No army, no friends, no kingdom. Just one man, floating alone on a piece of broken wood in the middle of an endless sea. Sometimes heroes don't lose because they're weak. Sometimes they lose simply because life keeps asking for more than anyone can give. The waves carried him to an island called Ogygia. There, he met Calypso, a beautiful nymph who fell in love with him. She offered him something almost impossible to refuse. Stay here. You'll never grow old. You'll never die. You can live forever. Imagine hearing that offer. No more storms, no more suffering, no more fear. Immortality. Most people would probably say yes. Odysseus didn't. Every evening, he walked to the shore, looked across the sea, and thought about home. Not because Ithaca was perfect, not because life there had been easy, but because it was his. Years passed. According to the myth, even the gods eventually began to pity him. Athena, who had always admired Odysseus' intelligence, pleaded his case. Finally, Zeus gave the order. Calypso had to let him go. Not because Poseidon had forgiven him, he hadn't, but because even the king of the gods decided this journey had lasted long enough. When Odysseus finally reached Ithaca, almost 20 years had passed since he first sailed away. Think about that. His son had grown from a baby into a man. Many people believed he was dead. His palace was filled with powerful men trying to marry his wife Penelope, not to win her heart, but to take his throne. Even after everything he'd survived, Odysseus still wasn't home. Not really, because nobody recognized him. Athena disguised him as an old beggar, and for the first time, the king walked through his own kingdom as a stranger. He watched people mock him, ignore him, push him aside. He listened as others spoke about him as though he were already history. Most men would have revealed themselves immediately. Odysseus waited. He watched. He listened. He planned. Even after 20 years, he hadn't forgotten his greatest strength: patience. Then came the moment everything had been building toward. Penelope announced a contest. Whoever could string Odysseus's great bow and shoot an arrow cleanly through 12 axe heads would win her hand. One by one, the suitors tried. None of them could even bend the bow. Then, the old beggar stepped forward. People laughed until he picked up the bow, strung it effortlessly, released the arrow, and sent it through every axe without missing once. Silence. Then he looked up and said the words no one expected to hear. "I am Odysseus." What happened next became one of the most famous scenes in Greek mythology. With the help of his son, Odysseus defeated the suitors and reclaimed his home. Not because he was the strongest man in Greece, but because after 20 years, through war, storms, monsters, temptation, and the anger of the gods, he had never stopped moving toward the same goal: home. That's why I think people still tell the story of Odysseus nearly 3,000 years later. Not because of the Cyclops, not because of the Sirens, not even because of the Trojan Horse. Those are unforgettable moments, but they aren't the heart of the story. The heart of the story is resilience. It's about getting knocked down again and again and again, and still choosing to stand up. Maybe that's why the gods could never truly control him. They could sink his ships, they could send monsters, they could keep him away from home for 20 years, but they could never make him give up. And in the end, that was the one thing that mattered most. So, was Odysseus the greatest warrior in Greek mythology? Probably not. Was he the strongest? Definitely not. But if you asked who had the greatest will to keep going, it's hard to find anyone who comes close. And maybe that's why his story has survived for nearly 3,000 years. Because deep down, all of us are trying to find our way home to something. A place, a dream, a family, or even the person we used to be.
The Story Vault. Unlock the untold.